Hey everyone, it's Justine and welcome to a new video. Today I am continuing on with my April collaboration event, and today I'm collaborating with Ingrid. Each of us have 5 different techniques that we often forget about when we're card making that are tried but true, beautiful ways of making cards that again may have been kind of brushed under the carpet the last little while. So be sure to check out Ingrid's video after mine. I have her linked in the video description below, and we are each showing off some excellent techniques. So let's get started. The first technique I'm going to be showing off is double stenciling. It's something that we forget about because we never think to layer one stencil on top of the other. Now, I personally find the best thing to do is to pick a stencil first that has a lot of blank space. This stencil is probably the smallest amount of blank space that I would go to normally. You could use things like solid circles, solid rectangles, or very wide spaces. I've done this technique in a previous video that I absolutely love, but I no longer own that stencil, so I'll link to it up above in the right hand corner or below in the video description if you want to check that out. It's a beautiful card. So I've attached my card panel to the back of my stencil, and then I've actually taped down the stencil to my mat here. And I'm going to be using some picket fence blending brushes, and I'm going to be using Party Dress ink from Catherine Pooler to add some color to my cardstock. So I'm going to be using a spread out motion, so I'm starting in the inside, working my way out, and I'm going to go ahead and add a few different colors here. The next one I'm adding is Tiki Torch, which one is my favorite colors from Catherine Pooler because it's a really beautiful tropical yellow, kind of a mild orange color. So I'm going to blend that out now from the party dress. And then the last color I'm going to be using is Bellini. Now I'm going to build up the colors fairly dark, but I don't want to go the darkest that they can go just now because I'm going to be stenciling over top with the exact same colors again. So now what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to layer a second stencil over top. This is a beautiful stencil from Hurley that has come out, and I'm going to leave the old stencil underneath. And you can line up the stencils perfectly, especially if they're the same size. And I'm just going to go over with those exact same colors all over again. So the party dress in the middle, then the Tiki Torch, and then the Bellini. And this time I want to make sure I'm going as dark as possible with the ink so you see the contrast on it. This is a great way to stretch your stencils. Now the reveal really is everything with this technique, so I'm going to remove the first stencil and you'll be able to see some of those detailed lines. Then the second one and you'll see all those details in between. The bigger the space on your first stencil, the more detail you're going to see. I paired it up with this semi-cursive die from My Favorite Things that says hello, just in some bold black, and I think that's all that this card needed because I want the focus to be on the background. My next technique is one of my favorites called the Acetate smush technique, or you can call it whatever you like. I'm going to go ahead and add some colors onto a piece of acetate. This piece of acetate here is actually the backing to one of my clear stamps. I'm adding the colors All That Jazz, Aquatini, and Mint to Be. I'm then going to go ahead with my distress sprayer or just any spray bottle, and I'm going to spray it with water until the water starts to form little beads. I'm using a piece of watercolor cardstock here, some Canson watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to be placing the color down on the acetate. I'm going to smoosh it around here until I'm happy with the sort of background that I'm going to get, but this is an easy way to add watercolor without having to have brushes, any sort of fancy watercolor paints, or in my opinion, any sort of talent. I'm not a great watercolorer, so this is just perfect for me. So I'm just going ahead and just adding and getting rid of those droplets. I kind of swipe them off to the bottom so that it kind of picked up all that liquid, and then I was all finished. I topped it off with a sentiment stamp from scrapbook.com. We will always be best friends because let's get real, you know too much. The next technique is Joseph's coat. This is an actual technique I was introduced to from Catherine Pooler herself, and I'm going to go ahead and get started by ink blending a background very quickly here. I'm going to actually ink blend a couple of backgrounds here in case I need one for later. So I'm going in once again with that Tiki Torch. I then went ahead with some Tutti Frutti, which is a beautiful sort of orangey, getting into a red color. Then I followed up by Party Dress and lastly Flirty Fuchsia, this is one of my favorite color combinations. It's very tropical looking, very lovely, and I am going to continue. I'm going to let that background dry. I let it sit for about 1 or 2 minutes. I'm now going to take a stamp from Altenew. This is called Frosted Garden. When choosing a stamp for this technique, you do want stamps with lots of solid space. So these flowers here have lots of solid areas. That's really important. You don't want anything that's going to be very fine details because the technique's not going to show very well. I'm going to make sure that my ink is all dry by adding a little bit of an embossing bag to it, making sure none of that embossing powder is going to stick. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp these stamps using some embossing ink. Now that they're all stamped and they're ready to go, I'm going to go ahead and grab a scrap piece of computer paper to catch my embossing powder and to act as a filter. And I'm going to go ahead and add some clear embossing powder on top of all of these flowers, being very careful not to touch the card panel with my fingers, as the oils from my fingers can rub off on the cardstock and get the embossing powder stuck to them. Which is why I tend to pick these up with tweezers and then just very carefully grab at the side. You can see all of those flowers there all ready to go, and you can see just how solid they are with the embossing powder on them. I am going to go ahead and grab my heat tool now and just melt that embossing powder. Clear embossing powder is one of the easiest to work with because it goes from a white to a very clear when it's ready, so you always know when you've embossed the entire area. I'm now going to go ahead and grab my blending tool once again and some black soot distress ink, and I'm just going to go along my entire background. You can make this as dark or as light as you like. It depends on what kind of look that you're going for. I kind of decided to go through a medium tone here because I didn't want to spend all day inking up my background. So this gray ink is now going to be resisted by the embossed areas, and later on I'm just going to grab a paper towel and wipe off the areas that are embossed in case any ink did happen to get stuck on top. So you'll notice that the clear embossing powder resisted and kept the color from underneath that's in that blend, but the background, the rest of it, is kind of a blackish color with some of that color showing through, and I absolutely love this technique. I think it's absolutely stunning. I paired it with a Hello Die from My Favorite Things because I thought this powerful white blob of brightness was going to brighten up my card really well. Did you like that description? Because I think it was pretty awesome. The next one is watercolor stamping, another faux watercolor look that I love because, again, I'm not that great at watercoloring and I'm not a huge fan of spending a ton of time watercoloring. I'm going to use the same stamps as I did before. These are the Frosted Garden stamps from Altenew. I have them all laid out on my MISTI and ready to go. I have a piece of watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to ink the background of all of these stamps. I'm going to be using, I believe I used Orange Twist from Catherine Pooler. You can use any dye ink that you like. Anything that's going to react with water is completely fine. I'm going to make sure I have really good coverage on these stamps, and I don't really have to worry too much about that because I'm using a proper ink here. And then I'm going to grab my spray bottle once again. This is a super easy technique, and I'm going to spritz the stamps a couple of times with some water. You can see I did that about 3 times, and I'm going to stamp down on the watercolor cardstock. It is going to lose some of the detail from the stamps, but it's going to give me sort of a watercolor look, and that's what I was going for. So when I lift up my MISTI, you can see here that I have a nice wet background that has a faux watercolor look. I paired this up with the Thanks die from My Favorite Things that's in a beautiful script sentiment, and I had cut that out in black cardstock. I love the way that it turned out. My last technique here is scoring accents. Now this is so much easier to do when you have a score pal or a scoring tool. I only have my paper trimmer, but my paper trimmer does have a scoring tool on it. And you can really do any sort of pattern you like. I decided to do a diagonal pattern on my cardstock, and I actually skipped a ½ an inch in between each area. I could have flipped it around and did another crisscross pattern in order to make sort of X's on it, and then I could have embellished with things like Nuvo drops. Yanis Makula is very famous for doing backgrounds like that, but you can really add any sort of score lines, whether it's adding a frame around a sentiment, adding a couple of focus lines in a certain area, or making your own pattern. It turns out really great with all this texture, and it's a really inexpensive technique that you can use with some very few beginner tools. I paired it with this beautiful big Thanks die from Concord and Ninth, as well as some Nuvo drops for accents. Here's a final look at all the cards created in this video featuring the 5 techniques we often forget about. Don't forget to check over at Ingrid's channel for 5 additional techniques that you might have forgotten about. She makes amazing landscape cards and just a really stunning YouTube channel. I also have some suggested videos as well as the subscribe button if you're interested, and I will see you on Friday for another video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye for now.